1457 BC, Egypt finds itself in great danger. The country's former allies in the Near East have joined forces, threatening Egypt's borders. But Pharaoh Thutmose III and his soldiers won't wait for the enemy to strike. They head towards Megiddo, a fortress city near the Carmel Mountains in modern Israel. Beyond these hills, the enemies of Pharaoh wait, ready to attack. Going out to meet them is a high-risk strategy. The future of the Pharaoh and of his empire depend on its success. In the face of this barrier, Pharaoh's armies halt. As they gather in the camp, there is a critical disagreement about the best route to take. No one knows where the enemy has positioned his forces. His generals advised Thutmose to send his men around the mountains. Pharaoh must decide. The fate of the empire is at stake. The Egyptians are in Canaan, 4 weeks' march from their own territory. This region, now roughly Palestine and Lebanon, is Egypt's security zone. The city-states here were neutral or under Egyptian control. Until the Mitanni, Egypt's greatest rival, stole their loyalty. Meanwhile, in Egypt's capital, Thebes, the Pharaoh's subjects eagerly await news of the campaign. Like all of Egypt, Thebes' wealth depends on trade and the tributes of subdued territories. Now, all that is at risk. Bustling with more than 50,000 people, this is one of the biggest cities in the world. Time hasn't diminished its magnificence. Even some of the bright paint miraculously clings to the columns. Triumphant reliefs tell of Thutmose's glorious reign. Yet with foreign powers threatening the country, the proud Egyptians were forced to acknowledge they weren't alone in the world.
This required an interesting change in attitude because in early periods of Egyptian history, the Egyptian word for Egyptian was the same as the Egyptian word for human being. In the New Kingdom, they began to recognize the greater equality of foreigners, Syrians, Sudanese, Cretans, whatever.
Egypt's neighbors enviously gazed on the country's enormous prosperity. While adjacent peoples suffered from frequent droughts, the Egyptians were blessed by geography and enjoyed regular, plentiful harvests. Though Egypt is 90% desert, the Nile watered wide, fertile fields that grew ample grain to feed some 3 million people. This easy abundance made the empire one of the most stable societies of the ancient world. And through trade, the people of the Nile magnified their wealth, funding the world's largest monuments, the pyramids. Clearly, the gods must have loved the Egyptians.
Egyptians were probably a very arrogant people because they were convinced that no one had it better than the Egyptians. The gods had given Egypt the most wonderful country in the world, and most foreigners who came here said the same thing. You've got this wonderful river that always provides water. You've got these wonderful fields that always provide crops. You don't have to work very hard to grow these things. This is heaven on earth.
Thutmose grows up in a world that knows neither famine nor war. He comes to the throne as a child after his father's early death. But the little king is far too young to rule. So his aunt and stepmother, Hatshepsut, takes over as regent. Tradition dictates that pharaohs be men, but Hatshepsut aspires to divine authority, to rule for life. She gathers power and finally claims the throne through classical political networking.
I've tried to put together myself a list of all those government officials and high nobility who stood behind her. And that may be the secret. There may have been a kind of, I was going to say cabal, but that may be too strong a word, a coterie of supporters who were quite influential, more so than we think today.
To affirm her legitimacy as regent, Hatshepsut alters her appearance on temple reliefs and official statues. At first, she's portrayed as a woman with breasts and feminine features. But soon she dons the ceremonial beard worn by pharaohs before her. Hatshepsut has officially transformed into a male pharaoh. Although Thutmose will be her future rival, Hatshepsut employs the country's best teachers for the boy. He learns astronomy, mathematics, religion and medicine. They teach him about Egypt's victories, but they also warn him about the great threat Egypt faces: foreign domination. Only 2 centuries earlier, a foreign tribe wrested control of northern Egypt, much to the shock of the people. They had always believed their country was invincible. Yet, in 1648 BC, the Hyksos, a nomadic people from the northeast, had moved in. They split the empire into 2 rival factions. For millennia, the country had been protected by its natural boundaries. Inhospitable deserts flanked the empire to the east and to the west, making invasion almost impossible. An army would die of thirst before it came in sight of an enemy. To the north, Lower Egypt was protected by the marshes of the Nile Delta. No enemy could cross them, or so it seemed. And far to the south, the rocks and rapids of the Nile cataracts made the river unnavigable along great stretches. The Egyptians were fully aware of their great good fortune.
Egypt is naturally protected, and if the government of the day simply keeps up a few border forts with a handful of garrison troops, that's all that's needed. You can easily keep anybody out. And they did for the first 15 centuries of their history. They were remarkably successful in keeping all foreigners that were unwanted out of the country.
But the Hyksos were different. With just one technological advancement, they infiltrated the Delta and then went on the attack from inside the country. To speed their invasion, the Hyksos used a new and terrifying weapon: the chariot. With this superior technology, they drove the Egyptian militias far to the south. On and on they rolled. It seemed nothing could stop them. There was one attempt to fight them off. An ancestor of Thutmose, King Sequenin-Ra-Ta, made a stand. A pharaoh facing the impossible, a full-scale invasion of his country. But he had no chance against this well-armed, superior fighting force from distant lands. Sequenin-Ra-Ta paid with his life. His mummy clearly shows the terrible wounds that led to an agonizing death.
That really had shaken the ego of the Egyptians, you know, to be invaded by these people that they despised, and successfully invaded for 108 years. That was a blow to their pride and a blow to their whole world vision.
After King Sequenenra-Ptah, King Ahmose, the ruler of Thebes, finally put an end to the foreign domination. Archaeologists pieced together this relief, the only account of Ahmose's victory over the Hyksos. Ahmose had learned from his enemies and beat them at their own game. He built war chariots to expel the invaders from his country. Ahmose reunited Egypt's north and south, heralding what's known as the New Kingdom, whose pharaohs swore to restore Egypt's glory and face down all foreign threats. Always. But in the Near East, a new power is already gathering strength. The Mitanni, a warrior tribe more formidable than the Hyksos and bent on expansion. The Mitanni are trying to weaken Egypt's influence in the northeast. They forge alliances with the rulers of the Canaan region, promising to free them from the taxes imposed by Egypt. As the Mitanni close in on Egypt's borders, their ranks swell with their enemies' former vassals. In the Egyptian capital of Thebes, time is running out. But Thutmose, now grown, and Hatshepsut disagree on what to do. He wants to mobilize his army immediately to intercept the enemy before it reaches the borders of Egypt. Hatshepsut prefers to wait. She wants to avoid war at all costs, especially a war beyond the boundaries of the empire. And even though Thutmose is the rightful heir, Hatshepsut has yet to surrender the throne. Thutmose insists that his strategy is the only way to save Egypt. But Hatshepsut calls the shots, and he must obey.
I think that distinction between Hatshepsut as a conservative, looking backward in a sense, with her roots in the past, as opposed to Thutmose III, who adopts this new outlook of expansion and involvement and a dynamic approach to life.
Thutmose, denied his war against the Mitanni, directs his attention elsewhere, to the region between Egypt and Nubia, a scene of constant conflict to the south. His ancestors had already built a chain of fortresses along the Nile. But the young king wants to reinforce them, flexing his military muscle and proving that Egypt is still strong. The Nubians, fearsome warriors, constantly raided Egypt from the south. Today, most of Egypt's border fortresses have disappeared. Their remains were swallowed up in the 1960s when the Aswan Dam created Lake Nasser. But thanks to old archaeological records, we have a sense of what these forts looked like. Around 500 soldiers lived in each fort complex, which operated like a small walled town. They contained barracks for the soldiers, storehouses for food, workshops and temples. Watchtowers on the walls provided an unobstructed view for kilometers. But these forts weren't just